If you like your histories sweeping and slightly outdated, then today's series just might be for you. Today I'll be reviewing The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. Welcome back to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we'll be looking at the introduction to a series. I'm actually about halfway through this series, and so before I went and did each of the books individually, I also wanted to give a quick overview of the series as a whole. Now you might be wondering, Spencer, why in the world are you reviewing a series of books that came out 50 years ago and were started nearly 100 years ago? And the reason is that, for starters, I like to review everything that I read, and second of all, because this is actually a book series I wanted to read for a very long time, and it has taken me a very long time to actually read it. Therefore, every year that passes that I don't read it, that's another year that it becomes slightly more outdated, so I wanted to just do that now. The first book in this series came out in 1935. Our Oriental Heritage is the name of the first book in this series, and it goes up to 11 books. By the way, this is the series. It's right here. I'm currently on The Age of Reason Begins. So I have a lot that I need to go back and review and to clarify. But before I do that, I wanted to just say a few things about this series as a whole, maybe a little bit about the author and his wife, and just some general impressions that I have. I do think each book clearly has enough material to merit their own reviews. I do think that there are some commonalities from one book to the next that is very much worth going over right now. The author, Will and Ariel Durant, actually only Will is considered the author on the first 6 books in the series, although I believe his wife Ariel was pretty heavily involved from the get-go, at least in terms of proofreading and editing. But by the 7th book, she had become so involved in the researching and even some of the writing that she got credit from the 7th book on. Both Will and Ariel Durant were born in the late 19th century. I believe Ariel is about a decade younger than Will. Will is actually a philosopher by trade, and his first real book was called The Story of Philosophy, and it was quite successful. It was successful enough that it helped Will and Ariel to go explore the world, and that's what set them on this journey to write this sweeping history of the story of civilization. While we're at it, let's go ahead and address the title of the series, because that's probably one of the biggest problems with this whole series. They call it The Story of Civilization, but if you look at the books and you look at the titles, you quickly realize it's really just a history of Western civilization. It would have been nice if they clarified that. Obviously, attitudes in 1935 were a little different as to what should have been considered a civilization, although I would imagine that they had an idea that the Middle Eastern civilizations could have been considered very successful civilizations, or Chinese civilizations, but they choose to just use the term broadly. And besides the first book, they really do not go into a whole lot of detail of civilizations outside of Western Europe. To teach about Western civilization and the history of Western Europe, you do have to touch upon other civilizations. We'll go with Eastern Europe, and they do discuss the Middle Eastern empires, and they do have a little bit of discussion of Africa, but they by no means are going to engage with an actual world history despite the title of the series. Also, like I said, it's first introduced in 1935, which means that some of the ideas and some of the approaches are a little outdated. What I mean by outdated, obviously, there was still some research to come forward in terms of figuring out some finer details about some of the things that he goes over in these books, but he also reflects a little bit of some outdated ideas and terminology. I think the first time that I really noticed this is when he starts to talk about the ancient nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and he uses some interesting language to describe the Jewish people, which I don't think has aged particularly well. Additionally, when he talks about a lot of East Asian countries, he uses this concept of the mysterious East, which is something that you see heavily criticized in books like Orientalism by Edward Said. He is definitely promoting this idea throughout the book series. So when I say a little dated, I think that's a good evidence of it. The strengths of this book series are myriad. I think probably the most obvious one is just how expansive it is. I think it is very challenging for any historian to give a history that goes beyond maybe a couple centuries, that doesn't cover maybe just one area, and he tries to cover all of Europe, and like I said, even tangentially other parts of Afro-Eurasia. And so there's a lot going on here, and that means that as big as this series is, it's actually by no means comprehensive. I felt like a lot of the sections that I read that covered pretty famous people were still much shorter than you would expect, considering this is 11 massive books that range somewhere between 600 to, I believe at least one of the books is over 1,000 pages. I think the Age of Faith is just under 1,100 pages. And so we're talking a lot of pages and a lot to cover, but he still has a lot for you to fill in yourself and for you to do a lot of your own research. I think most people would say, and this is definitely something that you're going to find in other reviews, is that a strength of this series, not just the scope, is that Will Durant is a very clear and concise writer. He has a great way of covering a lot of material. He has a great way of taking in pretty much everything that had been written about the subject up to that point and giving a nice digested version of it. That being said, because it is so old, so much more has come out on almost every topic that he covers. But one of the things that I think is really to his strength throughout the whole series from beginning to end is that he quotes significantly from primary sources. And that's one thing that hasn't changed a lot in the last 100 years or so since he started this project. Primary sources don't change a ton. We may find a few new ones here and there, but especially the most well-known primary sources are still going to be the same ones that we're consulting nowadays, especially for stuff that happened 2,000, 3,000, even 4,000 years ago. And so I would say that that's one of the great strengths of the whole book series. The series goes up to the Age of Napoleon. That's the 11th book. And that was near the end. As a matter of fact, one of the things that you'll see as you read the books is that the goalpost for where exactly Will Durant wanted to end was constantly changing. I believe in the first book, he says he planned on writing like 3 or 4 volumes. And so the scope of each book was probably meant to be much bigger, and as he got more into it and got closer to the present, you can see that the time frames are going to get collapsed to much smaller, and they're going to stop engaging so much with tangential civilizations. It's going to be focused much more on, say, Germany or France or England, and that will be reflected in each of the volumes, is what country he was a little more focused on and which country he was a little more interested in as he was writing that volume. Just to give you an idea of the quality of the writing, Will and Ariel Durant did collectively win the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction in 1968 for, I believe, the 10th volume, so the second to last volume. So it has always been a well-read and a well-received, at least in the larger public, a well-received series. So I think that's actually one of the great values of this book series, is that it has been in the culture, although maybe not as well-known currently as it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. But when I talk to other history professors or historians, they're very much aware of this series. That being said, it is not a series that they would use in, say, their classroom, because it is too broad and sweeping that there's just not really a whole lot of use for it in any classroom you'd be in that is trying to cover anything any more specific than just civilization as a whole. And so that would be one of its weaknesses in terms of how well known it is and how much it is still cited to this day. Although I know I've seen Dan Carlin cite it frequently, so you know that there's at least one big name in history, well, popular history, that still consults this big series. So who is this series for? That is really hard to say. It is 11 massive volumes, so it's not for the faint of heart. It is someone that is very much going to be interested in reading this. Also, it is going to be for people that want to read a broad history, but to be honest, you're probably already going to have a decent understanding. So maybe a history buff, or somebody that has always just had an interest in history or even majored in history. I think you would find some value in it. That being said, you're probably not going to use it to get into any deeper arguments or any ongoing debates about any real topic, because it just doesn't cover that in any great detail. And he doesn't use a whole lot of footnotes, especially in a scholarly type of way. He uses footnotes more in a way to just add a little bit more of interesting information. He doesn't use it in a way to help you track down where he got that information from or anything like that. Also, like I've already said, it's not going to be for someone that can't handle some of the things that are clearly a little out of date. If you're going to take up this series or any single book in this series, you definitely should be prepared to cross-reference some of the scholarship that he quotes. Not that he was wrong at the time, but just some things have changed and some attitudes and ideas have been tweaked, or in some cases altogether turned over. I wouldn't recommend this for people that say they just want to know a little bit more about history. Obviously, the scope of it is going to be an impediment, and you just need to choose what part of history you want to know a little bit more about. This isn't the way to go about it. I love history. I am a generalist that pretends to be a specialist. You have to be to get your PhD. And so I am very much interested in reading broadly, and so that's why I wanted to tackle this series. Additionally, since it's such a well-distributed series, if you go into used bookstores, you can usually find almost all of these books and sometimes many different editions of them. And so it's usually a cheap series to get a hold of, but as you can tell, it looks quite nice on my bookshelf. It makes me look well read and very intelligent. That is why I really wanted to tackle this series. And I have by no means regretted it, but I have had to tackle it in a very slow and deliberate approach. I read 10 pages of it a day, which means that I am more than a year and a half into it, and I probably will need another year and a half to finish it. So total, it'll take me about 3 years to read this series, but it's not the primary series that I'm reading. It's always in the background, which makes it a lot easier to say, I'll just take my time with it and I will finish it when I will. If you've read any of these books, or if you've read anything else by Will and Ariel Durant, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to know other people's thoughts concerning this series as a whole, or any of the books individually, although I do plan on putting out individual episodes for each book. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. And until next time, keep those pages turning.